They were the men closest to the most feared dictator of the 20th century. They protected him from assassinations, accompanied him in his final days in the bunker, and witnessed the collapse of the Third Reich. But when Germany fell into ruin, what became of them? Were they captured, executed, or did they manage to disappear into anonymity? This is the untold story of Adolf Hitler's personal bodyguards. A journey into the heart of the Nazi regime through those who swore to protect their leader until death. What happened to Hitler's bodyguards after World War II? The story of Adolf Hitler's bodyguards did not have a glamorous or institutional origin, but rather developed in the turbulent political climate of Bavaria in the early 1930s. At that time, Hitler had not yet become the feared dictator of the Third Reich. He was simply the charismatic leader of a growing nationalist party, surrounded by constant tension and danger. His personal safety became a priority, as he was a frequent target of threats from political adversaries, especially communists and members of rival militias. Faced with this risky situation, the Nazi leadership deemed it necessary to create a special protective corps dedicated exclusively to safeguarding the life of the future Führer. Thus, in 1932, a small bodyguard unit was born, initially made up of just 8 men. This formation had several names in its early days, first known as Stoßtrupp Hitler, and later adopting the more formal title of SS Begleitkommando des Führers, which can be translated as the leader's escort command. The members of this security cell were selected with extreme rigor. Military training or combat experience was not enough. They must demonstrate unwavering loyalty to Hitler and total adherence to National Socialist ideology. Fanatically devoted to the SS, these men were willing to die rather than allow anything to happen to their leader. During the early years of the Nazi rise, this small contingent accompanied Hitler every step of the way, escorting him on his train journeys, guarding him during his speeches, and protecting him during his private meetings. Although their numbers were small, their role was critical, ensuring Hitler's survival in the midst of a still convulsed Germany. Over time, this unit would become the seed of a much larger and more sophisticated security apparatus, a network feared both at home and abroad. These initial bodyguards would lay the foundation for the system that would protect the man who accumulated the most power and generated the most hatred across Europe during World War II. Erich Kempka, the Führer's last driver. Erich Kempka was neither a senior military officer nor a regime strategist, but for more than 10 years he was behind the wheel of one of the most symbolic positions in the Third Reich. He was Adolf Hitler's personal chauffeur. Aboard the dictator's iconic black Mercedes, Kempka not only transported the Nazi leader but was also responsible for coordinating the entire fleet of vehicles transporting senior officials, aides, and members of the regime's inner circle. In the final days of April 1945, as Berlin crumbled under the Soviet siege, Kempka remained in Hitler's service. From his post, he observed the comings and goings of senior officers and key figures entering and leaving the Führer bunker as the defeat of the Third Reich became inevitable. On April 30th, 1945, after the suicide of Hitler and Eva Braun, Kempka was summoned to carry out one of the most disturbing orders he had ever received. Together with Heinz Linge and Otto Günsche, he removed the dictator's body from the bunker and helped douse it with gasoline in the bombed-out Chancellery Gardens. It was then cremated just as Hitler had instructed. Years later, Kempka would describe that scene as the most terrifying and surreal moment of his life, watching the body of the man who, for more than a decade, had been the symbol of absolute power in Europe, consumed. After completing that final task, Kempka attempted to return to the bunker aboard a tank, seeking a way out or a last chance to rescue the survivors. However, he soon realized that the situation was unsustainable. being captured by the Soviets meant facing almost certain death or years of imprisonment under inhumane conditions. Like many others in Hitler's entourage, he undertook a desperate flight westward, hoping to surrender to the Americans. After several weeks on the run, he was finally arrested on June 20, 1945, near Berchtesgaden, Hitler's famous alpine retreat known as the Eagle's Nest. Unlike the treatment of prisoners in Soviet hands, the Americans considered Kempka more useful as a witness than a criminal. They interrogated him extensively about Hitler's movements, the dynamics within the Führer bunker, and the collapse of the Nazi regime. His statements largely coincided with those of other witnesses, bolstering his credibility. Kempka was not prosecuted for war crimes or formally charged with any crime. He spent 2 years in custody until his release in 1947. He returned to a divided Germany where he attempted to rebuild his life in relative anonymity. However, in 1951, he decided to give his version of events. He published a book entitled I Was Hitler's Chauffeur, one of the first memoirs written by someone who had been part of the dictator's daily circle. In its pages, Kempka offered a first-hand account of daily life alongside Hitler. Convoy transfers, security protocols, personal interactions, but above all, he coldly and accurately recounted the Führer's final days in his bunker, including the harrowing moment when he helped destroy his body. The book made Kempka a household name, though not without controversy. His account, though valuable to historians, was criticized for the detached, almost technical tone with which he described events steeped in horror. Even so, his testimony became a key source for reconstructing the final hours of the Third Reich. Erich Kempka died in 1975 in Freiburg, West Germany. He died without being tried or convicted. But he left behind a cold and revealing account of the end of a regime that changed the fate of the 20th century. He was, in short, the man at the wheel of the apocalypse. Although some passages in the book were embellished by the editors for commercial purposes, something Kempka himself would later acknowledge, admitting that not everything exactly matched his memories, his work ultimately became a source of unquestionable value for historians. After its publication, Kempka chose to withdraw from the public eye once again. He remarried, took on various jobs, and avoided any media attention. He was never summoned to participate in the denazification trials, nor did he face accusations of direct collaboration with the crimes of the Third Reich. While some bunker survivors offered testimony on camera or sought notoriety in the years that followed, Kempka chose silence. His story was written in his memoirs, and he let that version speak for him. He died on January 24, 1975, in Freiburg, West Germany. By then, very few members of Hitler's inner circle remained alive, and even fewer were willing to speak publicly. Despite its limitations, Kempka's book remains one of the few first-person accounts of the Führer bunker, Hitler's private life, and the dense, claustrophobic and desperate atmosphere that marked the final days of the Nazi regime. Kurt Gildisch, the fallen shadow of the Führer. One of the first to command the team tasked with Adolf Hitler's direct protection was SS Sturmbannführer Kurt Gildisch, who led this unit between 1933 and 1934. Gildisch was one of the oldest members of the SS, considered at the time a loyal man aligned with the ideals of the National Socialist Party. However, his tenure in the position was brief. Internal tensions, his personal ambitions, and above all, a growing dependence on alcohol eventually eroded his position. In the spring of 1934, he was dismissed and replaced as part of a key restructuring of the Führer's personal security arrangements. It was then that a new unit emerged, the Führerbegleitkommando, FBK, a body that had its origins in the Bavarian police but soon fell under the direct influence of Heinrich Himmler and the SS apparatus. This formation assumed responsibility for Hitler's external protection, including access control and surveillance of the surrounding area. Despite these changes, the original SS Begleitkommando was not immediately disbanded. It continued to perform direct escort duties and remained the Führer's immediate personal guard. At large events or official visits, both bodies worked together. The FBK was responsible for keeping strangers away, while the SS escorts ensured that no one could physically approach the leader without express authorization. In this context, another key figure emerged, Bruno Günsche, a young SS officer who eventually became commander of the Escort Command. Günsche enjoyed an unusual closeness with Hitler, whom he accompanied not only to official events but also in private moments. They shared relaxed conversations, met for tea, and participated in briefings. His loyalty to Hitler was absolute, but his arrogant personality and tendency toward excess frequently placed him in conflict. Despite his proximity to the inner circle of power, his conduct would eventually take its toll. Throughout the 1930s, the SS Begleitkommando remained active as Hitler's personal escort as the Nazi regime consolidated its control over Germany. These men were present at all sorts of events, official visits, propaganda events, political meetings, and the Führer's national and international travel. Their role also included managing his private schedule, accompanying him on convoys, and maintaining close surveillance at all times. But with the outbreak of World War II in 1939, security needs changed dramatically. Growing threats, both external and internal, coupled with Hitler's growing paranoia, led to a complete reorganization of the protection system. That same year, the Führer Begleitkommando was formalized as a larger, more professionalized unit under the direct control of the SS. This new body absorbed many of the tasks originally performed by the old Begleitkommando. At the same time, the Reich Sicherheitsdienst, RSD, the Reich Security Service, was also strengthened, taking on broader functions in protecting the Führer, route planning, threat assessment, crowd control, and monitoring every location Hitler visited. With the implementation of this more complex and layered system, the old Close Protection Command was gradually relegated and little by little dissolved. Some of its members were absorbed into the FBK or the RSD. Others were reassigned to different SS units. By the early 1940s, the SS Begleitkommando ceased to exist as an independent unit, although its influence and legacy were maintained through those who remained in Hitler's direct service. Even in the final days of the Third Reich, when chaos gripped Berlin, several former members of that first close protection unit were still active. Some were inside the Chancellery bunker during the fall of the German capital in April 1945. They attempted to flee through the underground tunnels or were captured by Soviet troops as the city burned. Kurt Gildisch, the first commander of the escort, had been removed years before. After his dismissal, he was assigned to the Waffen-SS and sent to the Eastern Front, where he was wounded. At the end of the war, he was captured by the Soviets on May 2, 1945, and spent several years as a prisoner. He was finally released and died in 1956. Bruno Günsche, perhaps the most iconic figure of the Escort Command, had a different fate. His problematic behavior and clashes with senior members of the regime ultimately undermined his career. In 1944, following further accusations of improper behavior, he was dismissed by Himmler's orders, demoted, and also sent to the Eastern Front. Günsche survived the war, managed to avoid high-profile trials, and lived out his remaining days in West Germany, where he died in 1982. He never offered a full account of his role alongside Hitler or spoke openly about his past. Many of the men who formed part of the Begleitkommando, Adolf Hitler's personal bodyguard, vanished with the remnants of the Third Reich. Some were redeployed to combat fronts when they were no longer needed as bodyguards. Others died on the battlefield or ended up in the hands of the Allies. Still others, taking advantage of the chaos of Germany's collapse, managed to disappear by assuming new identities in the turbulent post-war Europe. The fate of many remains unknown to this day, in part due to the lack of complete records and the secrecy with which the SS operated and protected its internal information. Despite their small numbers, the men of the Begleitkommando played a crucial role in the dictator's inner circle. During the early years of the Nazi regime, they were those closest physically to Hitler, accompanying him at all times and providing constant protection. However, with the passage of time and the increasing bureaucratization of the Reich security apparatus, their role was taken on by new, larger and more specialized formations, such as the Führer Begleitkommando, FBK, and the Reich Sicherheitsdienst, RSD. Today, the Begleitkommando is remembered as a key part of the Nazi regime's initial security system. Its size was limited, but its function and symbolism were enormous. It represented the first human wall around the Führer. Their post-war fate illustrates a common trend among officials of the Third Reich. Some were tried, others disappeared into anonymity, and many more never faced consequences for their involvement. Even in the final days of the Reich, when Hitler was locked in the Chancellery bunker as Berlin burned under Soviet bombs, some veterans of that first escort remained at his side. Their contribution, although partly forgotten by official history, was still present. What remains of the Begleitkommando today is preserved in fragments, prisoners' statements, files declassified by the Allies, and some court documents. Its legacy is a dark reminder of how a small group of men, selected for their total obedience and ideological devotion, ended up as an integral part of a destructive power structure, only to later dissolve without leaving a trace. The Begleitkommando began as a modest unit, but it laid the foundations for a system of personal protection that lasted until the end of the regime. Its model would be replicated, expanded, and absorbed into other, more sophisticated structures. However, the Führer's security did not rest solely in the hands of the SS. There was also a less visible, more professional force focused on prevention, the Reich Sicherheitsdienst, RSD. Unlike the Begleitkommando, whose members were fervent National Socialists, RSD officers were usually drawn from the German police's Criminal Detective Corps, Kripo, and were trained in investigative methods and covert surveillance. Their mission was not to directly escort Hitler, but to protect his surroundings, inspecting rooms before his arrival, checking the identities of those present, recording potential threats, and ensuring that no risk went unnoticed. The RSD had its origins in an earlier unit called the Führerschutzkommando, FSK, established in 1933 to guard Hitler outside the state of Bavaria. In 1935, under the leadership of Heinrich Himmler, the FSK was merged with elements of the Kripo, giving rise to the RSD as it would be known for the remainder of the regime. Although its members wore SS uniforms and held SS ranks, its operations followed police rather than military protocols, and many of its operations were carried out with complete discretion. During the war years, Hitler's security was entrusted to two main branches, the Führer Begleitkommando, FBK, responsible for direct escort, and the Reich Sicherheitsdienst, which was responsible for securing the external environment. While the SS displayed itself as an omnipresent force in parades and public events, RSD agents worked in the shadows, ensuring that every detail was controlled and that the leader of the Third Reich was not in any danger. Together, these organizations formed a protective machinery that evolved with the war and reveals the extent to which the regime valued and feared for the safety of its supreme leader. The Führer's guardian, Johann Hans Rattenhuber. The leadership of the Reich Sicherheitsdienst, the service responsible for Adolf Hitler's personal security, was in the hands of a single man from its inception to the end, Johann Hans Rattenhuber. This Munich-born detective had joined the Führer's inner circle in the early years of the National Socialist movement. His professionalism, discretion, and reliability earned him the trust of both Heinrich Himmler and Hitler himself. Throughout the regime, Rattenhuber oversaw security at some of the most iconic sites of Nazi power, such as the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia and later the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. However, as the Third Reich began to crumble and the Soviet armies encircled Berlin, the RSD became a shadow of its former self. What was once a unit of specialized security and surveillance officers morphed into a makeshift defense force. During the Battle of Berlin in April 1945, its members armed themselves with rifles and pistols and took up defensive positions at the entrances to the underground bunker where Hitler was sheltering. They were no longer bodyguards, but desperate fighters. Rattenhuber remained by the Führer's side until the end. On April 30th, after Hitler's suicide, he was one of those in charge of guarding the garden area where the dictator's body was cremated. 2 days later, on May 2nd, he surrendered to Soviet forces along with other surviving RSD members. Unlike many high-ranking officers who committed suicide or died in combat, Rattenhuber was captured alive and became a source of extremely valuable information for the Soviets. He was taken to Moscow, where he was extensively interrogated. His testimony, collected in Soviet archives, became fundamental in reconstructing the final hours of the Nazi regime and the final moments inside the Berlin bunker. Thanks to his constant presence in that closed environment, his account offered intimate details about Hitler's state of mind, his final interactions, and the outcome of his life. This information was also useful during the Nuremberg trials, although Rattenhuber was not formally prosecuted. His role was considered more related to the dictator's personal safety than to the direct commission of war crimes. Even so, the Soviets did not release him. He remained a prisoner for a decade. He was only released in 1955 and allowed to return to East Germany. But his time at liberty was brief. He died in 1957. Some reports suggest that he remained under surveillance and was even being interrogated at the time of his death. The exact circumstances of his death were never fully clarified, and official records indicate that it occurred while he was still in Soviet custody. The other members of the RSD met various fates. Some were captured by British or American troops. Because their work focused on protection and surveillance rather than repressive operations or extermination, many were not considered priorities for prosecution. Consequently, several were released without major consequences and disappeared from public view, quietly integrating into civilian life in the post-war period. Unlike other branches of the Nazi security apparatus, such as the Gestapo or the Waffen-SS, the RSD lacked prominent figures and was not associated with mass atrocities. This relative lack of notoriety made its history more easily dissolved into oblivion. By the early 1950s, the RSD no longer existed. It was not officially dissolved. It simply disintegrated with the collapse of the regime. The unit's archives were mostly destroyed or lost. Its members dispersed, its structure disappeared, and its final commander died in custody without much attention. What was once an organization tasked with protecting the most powerful man in the Nazi era eventually faded into the dark folds of history. Essentially, the RSD was a professional security force composed primarily of career police officers and agents operating in the background. They didn't spearhead war crimes or run concentration camps, but they did accompany Hitler until his final days. Their legacy is ambiguous. They protected a dictator without necessarily having been executioners. Their story is that of a hidden cog in the great machine of the Third Reich, a piece that was deactivated with the collapse of the regime, and that today only survives in documentary fragments and in the testimonies left behind, especially those of Hans Rattenhuber. Thanks to these statements, it has been possible to reconstruct the final moments in the Berlin bunker, but beyond that, the RSD has been relegated to the margins of history, an almost forgotten appendage in the story of Hitler's fall. The Führer Begleitkommando, FBK. Adolf Hitler's personal escort during the war years was the most extreme reflection of the dictator's growing paranoia. As the Führer's power consolidated and his distrust of the world increased, so did the complexity of his security system. The initial SS bodyguards, chosen primarily for their loyalty and Bavarian origin, were replaced by a more specialized contingent, an elite guard trained not only to protect but also to accompany the Nazi leader in every aspect of his daily life, even in the most intimate settings. This group, known as the Führer Begleitkommando, was officially established in 1939, coinciding with the invasion of Poland and the outbreak of World War II. From that moment on, its members were present on all of Hitler's military and political movements, from the initial offensives in Western Europe to the desperate final days in the Berlin bunker. Some bodyguards formed part of the dictator's inner circle, accompanying him even during the final collapse of the Third Reich. The unit was recruited from the most loyal members of the SS, especially from the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler LSAH regiment, the Führer's personal guard. They were not common soldiers, but devoted National Socialists, trained in military discipline and imbued with ideological fervor. Wherever Hitler went, be it his Alpine residence at the Berghof, frontline barracks like the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, or the Chancellery in Berlin, the FBK was there, always at his side. What distinguished the FBK from other units like the Reich Sicherheitsdienst was not so much its function as its proximity. The RSD was responsible for external security. It conducted background checks, analyzed threats, planned routes, and organized peripheral surveillance. In contrast, the FBK was the only group authorized to remain with Hitler at all times. They escorted him in parades, shared space on his armored trains, and even guarded him in his private chambers. They were the only ones allowed to carry weapons in his immediate presence, an extraordinary display of trust from a leader obsessed with control and betrayal. The FBK's duties were varied. Armed escorts, yes, but also personal assistants, drivers, and trusted messengers. Sometimes they had to go unnoticed. During the 1936 Berlin Olympics, some members of the commando wore civilian or police uniforms to blend in with the crowd. They were invisible in peacetime and lethal in wartime. In the most intense years of the conflict, between 1942 and 1944, the FBK numbered around 30 to 40 personnel who rotated in shifts to ensure constant and unwavering vigilance. Unlike other SS formations, its members were rarely replaced, fostering a closed structure based on mutual trust. Hitler, who tended to maintain his distance even from his highest officials, allowed himself to joke with some of them, remember their names, and even display gestures of closeness uncommon in his usual demeanor. So strong was this bond that the Führer never allowed their weapons to be confiscated upon entering his private quarters. He trusted no one else in that way, and indeed the loyalty of the FBK was unquestionable. Most remained with him until the end, accompanying him during the siege of Berlin. Several FBK members became known after the war for their participation in the final days of the regime. Among them were Heinz Linge, his valet, Rochus Misch, the bunker's telephone operator, Erich Kempka, Hitler's personal chauffeur, and Hans Hermann Junge, a close bodyguard who died in combat after marrying his secretary, Traudl Junge. Towards the end of the war, the FBK bodyguards were not only responsible for the dictator's physical protection, they also brought him meals, organized his clothing, delivered confidential documents, and managed his daily affairs. They had become his closest assistants, integrated into every aspect of his private life. The FBK worked closely with the RSD, although each group maintained its own hierarchy. The RSD continued to operate under the structure of Himmler and the regime's intelligence apparatus. The FBK, on the other hand, answered directly to Hitler's personal circle, outside the formal control of the party or the SS. It was a security system based more on personal closeness than on official protocols. This closed circle reveals the extent to which the regime relied on relationships of absolute trust. Hitler's power rested, to a large extent, on the blind loyalty of these men, who remained by his side even when there was nothing left to defend. When the Allied advance became irreversible, Hitler retreated to his last refuge, the Führer bunker in Berlin. From that underground location, he attempted to maintain control of a Reich in ruins. Alongside him, the FBK continued to carry out its duties under extreme conditions. From January 1945, the unit was commanded by SS Obersturmführer Franz Schädler, an officer distinguished by his rigor, determination, and unwavering loyalty. Despite being wounded by shrapnel in the leg and suffering from a severe infection, Schädler remained in the bunker organizing shifts, managing access, and trying to maintain order as Berlin crumbled around him. Many already knew that all was lost. Even so, they continued to fulfill their duties, perhaps out of routine, conviction, or simply fear. But the circle remained closed. Until the end, Hitler retained his only trusted contact in the FBK. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide in their private quarters. The FBK members helped fulfill his last wish to cremate his body in the Chancellery Garden. It was the final act of blind obedience. A few days later, on May 2nd, Schädel, unable to move due to his wound and with no way to escape, committed suicide. His death symbolically marked the end of the command that had protected the Führer throughout the war. Amid the chaos, some FBK members attempted to break through Soviet lines. Several were captured, others managed to reach areas controlled by the Americans or British. Heinz Linge and Rochus Misch were captured by the Soviets and spent years in prison. Erich Kempka, on the other hand, surrendered to the Western Allied forces and survived the conflict. One of the original organizers of the Führer Begleitkommando, FBK, Richard Schulze-Kossens, managed to reach Czechoslovak territory at the end of the war and surrendered to American forces. However, he was later handed over to the Soviet authorities, who held him prisoner until his death in 1988. Unlike Nazi organizations such as the Gestapo or the feared Waffen-SS, the FBK was not the subject of major legal proceedings after the fall of the Third Reich. The Allied powers considered it an auxiliary body, charged exclusively with Hitler's personal security. Consequently, most of its members were interrogated, sent to prison camps, and in some cases released as early as 1946. Those captured by the Soviets did not fare as well. Many spent many years in captivity before regaining their freedom. At the end of the war, the FBK was dissolved without ceremony or official declaration. Its structure disintegrated completely. No central command or institutional continuity remained. The survivors retreated to civilian life. Some changed their identities, others took refuge in anonymity. Their small number, just under 50 members at their peak, made it easy for them to go unnoticed in a Europe preoccupied with its reconstruction. Very few former members of the FBK spoke publicly about their experience. Only a few, like Rochus Misch, broke their silence decades later through their memoirs. Heinz Linge also left a testimony of his years with Hitler. But the vast majority chose silence. To this day, historical studies acknowledge that very little is known about the complete structure of the FBK, its members, or its activities beyond the events that occurred during the final weeks of the Nazi regime. That elite of bodyguards, once made up of Hitler's most trusted men, ended up reduced to marginal notes in scattered documents, or simple mentions in accounts of the final days of the Reich. In essence, the Führer Begleitkommando was the closest nucleus to the Führer. They had no strategic or political functions, but they were direct witnesses to his rise, his glory, and his downfall. They were his shadows, his assistants, his loyalists until the very end. And when it all collapsed, they too disappeared into the ruins. The history of the FBK is ultimately a story of absolute loyalty, of proximity to power, and of oblivion. Its end was marked by surrender, suicide, or a desperate attempt to avoid the consequences of history's judgment. With the death of Franz Schädler and the fall of Berlin, the circle that had once protected the most powerful man in Germany vanished without a trace, caught in the collapse of a doomed empire. The last great witness to that intimacy with power was Rochus Misch. Although he was neither a political nor military protagonist, he became a key figure for his role as a telephone operator and Hitler's direct escort. He joined the SS in 1937 and soon became part of the Führer's inner circle. He was with him in all his residences and refuges, from the Berghof to the Wolf's Lair, and finally in the Führerbunker in Berlin. He was one of the last to see the dictator alive. On May 2, 1945, at dawn, Misch escaped from the bunker through a basement window. Decades later, he recounted the experience with a mixture of disbelief and resignation. "I'm leaving that bunker of death, all that drama, and someone is playing music." In his words to Der Spiegel magazine, he described how upon emerging, he found himself confronted by a surreal scene: two French soldiers playing a Hawaiian guitar in a Berlin subway station. For him, the war was over, but his personal hell was just beginning. Along with Hitler's personal pilot, Hans Bauer, and other survivors, he attempted to flee across the city. They reached the Nordbahnhof station, where the German capital appeared like a ghost town, reduced to ashes, smoking ruins, shattered facades, still burning fires. Berlin was now a field of rubble guarded by Soviet soldiers. Red Army patrols tirelessly scoured every corner in search of hiding Nazis. Misch tried to go unnoticed in civilian clothes but was identified and arrested. Bauer, wounded by shrapnel, could barely stand. Misch cared for him as best he could, improvising bandages from scraps of cloth and carrying him through the wreckage of the city. But the relief didn't last. When it became known that he had been part of Hitler's immediate entourage, the Soviet attitude changed completely. On May 5, 1945, Misch was separated from the group and taken to Moscow by agents of the feared NKVD, Stalin's secret police. For them, his value lay not in his rank, but in the information he could provide. At the time, Stalin remained convinced that Hitler had not died. Rumors circulated that he had fled to Spain or South America, and even among the Western Allies, doubts persisted. Therefore, the interrogations of Rochus Misch were intense, grueling, and brutal. They interrogated him for days with almost no breaks, with minimal food and in extreme conditions. They were looking for more than a confession. They wanted a version that supported their narrative, something useful even if it was false. But Misch didn't deviate from his testimony. He claimed he had seen Hitler's corpse, that he had been doused with gasoline and set on fire in the Chancellery garden, that Eva Braun lay lifeless beside him, that Goebbels wept when he confirmed the news, and that Bormann tried to take control. His account was coherent, accurate, but the Soviets refused to believe it. In later interviews, Rochus Misch admitted that the torture he was subjected to during his captivity became unbearable. His statements weren't enough. What Stalin demanded wasn't the truth, but confirmation of his deepest fears. Misch spent 9 years detained in Soviet camps before regaining his freedom. He returned to Germany in the mid-1950s. where he lived in relative anonymity for decades, until in his later years he began to recount what he had witnessed. He died in 2013, the last direct witness to what happened in Hitler's bunker. In a moment of absolute despair, he wrote a personal letter to Lavrenti Beria, the feared head of Soviet intelligence. In it he begged to be executed, "Please shoot me." But his plea went unheeded. Instead, the Soviet authorities decided to extend his confinement for almost another decade. During this long captivity, he was transferred between different prisons and labor camps, almost always under extreme conditions. One of them was located in Kazakhstan, where winter temperatures reached below -30 degrees Celsius. The prisoners slept on wooden planks, without mattresses or heating, and were forced to perform hard labor, digging roads, cutting down trees, carrying stones, all with minimal rations that barely allowed them to stand. He was later sent to prisoner of war camps in the Urals, where his physical condition deteriorated further. He contracted lung disease, severe digestive problems, and suffered from prolonged malnutrition. Like many captured Germans, he was subjected to collective punishment for his membership in the SS. For the Soviet regime, this was sufficient to condemn him without the need for any trial. The situation only began to change after Stalin's death in 1953. Under the new leadership of Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet Union initiated a policy of détente and gradually released thousands of German prisoners of war. Among them was Rochus Misch. After almost a decade of deprivation, he finally returned home. But it was no longer the Germany he had left behind. He found himself facing a divided nation, a Berlin split in two, where the wall was beginning to mark not only a physical border, but also an ideological one. Misch settled in West Berlin. He opened a small painting and decorating business, married, had a daughter, and for many years led a discreet life. To those who knew him, he was just another Berliner. Few knew that he had been part of Hitler's inner circle and that he had been present during the dictator's final hours. Over time, the silence he had maintained began to break. Beginning in the 1990s, Rochus Misch began giving interviews, participating in documentaries, and eventually publishing his autobiography, Hitler's Telephone Operator. In that book, as well as in many of his public appearances, he offered detailed descriptions of life in the bunker, the claustrophobic feeling, the constant smell of diesel, the sweat, the incessant bombing, and the fear that permeated the atmosphere. He recounted how Hitler spoke with increasing resignation, how Eva Braun silently arranged her hair, how Goebbels's children ran through the corridors, oblivious to the impending apocalypse. Yet what most disturbed many was not what he said, but how he said it. His account lacked emotion or regret. It was technical, almost surgical. He never expressed direct condemnation of Hitler. On one occasion, he told the Guardian newspaper, "He was not a monster, he was not a superman, he was the boss." That sentence encapsulated his perspective, that of a loyal subordinate rather than a repentant witness. For some, Misch personified the banality of blind obedience. For others, especially historians, he was a source of unique value, the last living witness to the collapse of the Third Reich from within power. On September 5, 2013, Rochus Misch died in Berlin at the age of 96. With his death, the last living chapter of the Chancellery bunker was definitively closed. There are no more eyes that have seen what he saw. Only his words, his memories remain, and the silent weight of the past which he carried with him until the end of his days. Although Germany was divided, Rochus Misch spent his final years walking the same streets he once walked in an SS uniform. A survivor of a regime that exterminated millions, his life was largely silent, but his story did not fade away. It still resonates like an uncomfortable echo of the past, reminding us that even in the darkest corners of history, human voices continue to speak. But Misch was not the only witness to that collapse. Another name, now almost forgotten, was Heinz Linge, Hitler's personal valet. Of all the men who served in his inner circle, few were as close to the dictator as he. From 1935, Linge was responsible for his clothing, his daily routine, and his most private habits. She accompanied him at the height of his power, and also at his decline. She was a silent witness to the rise and fall of the most feared man of the 20th century. On April 30th, 1945, when Hitler took his own life in the Führer bunker, Linge was standing just outside his room. Hearing the shot, he was one of the first to enter. Together with SS Adjutant Otto Günsche, he lifted the dictator's body and carried it through the narrow corridor leading to the Chancellery's back garden. There, under a sky covered in smoke, fire, and Soviet bombing, he carried out his commander's last order. He doused the body with gasoline and incinerated it, preventing it from falling into enemy hands as had happened to Mussolini. That dark scene would mark him forever. Linge was wounded in the leg during the subsequent escape attempt. Even so, he managed to escape from the bunker on May 1st with other survivors, including Misch. They reached the tunnels of the Lehrter Bahnhof railway station, but their freedom was short-lived. On May 2nd, 1945, he was captured by Soviet soldiers. From then on, his ordeal began. As with other members of Hitler's immediate entourage, he was transferred to Moscow and imprisoned in the dreaded Lubyanka prison, headquarters of the NKVD. There, the interrogations did not seek the truth, but rather to confirm Stalin's paranoia, who refused to accept the official version of his enemy's death. He suspected an escape, a double, a deception. He wanted a confession or a culprit. Heinz Linge was subjected to physical and psychological torture. He was stripped naked, beaten repeatedly, forced to remain in punishment positions for hours and accused of covering up Hitler's supposed escape to South America. But his story never changed. He maintained, time and again, that Hitler had committed suicide on April 30th, 1945, and that his body was cremated that same day in the Chancellery garden. His version coincided with those of Misch, Günsche, and other witnesses. Decades later, historians such as Roger Moorhouse would validate it as one of the most coherent and reliable. However, for the post-war Soviet authorities, the truth was not enough. Without a trial or the possibility of a defense, Linge was sentenced to 25 years of forced labor in the gulags, accused generically of war crimes not for specific acts, but simply for having served the Führer. He spent almost 10 years among freezing barracks, exhausting mines, and isolation as exhausting as the cold. He was trapped in oblivion. He wasn't released until 1955 as part of a diplomatic agreement between the USSR and the Federal Republic of Germany, already in the context of the thaw following Stalin's death. When he returned to West Germany, he found a country transformed, unrecognizable, and although he lived in relative discretion, he eventually wrote his memoirs Bis zum bitteren Ende, until the bitter end, in which he recounted with surgical precision the final days of the Third Reich. That testimony, despite lacking explicit remorse, became a fundamental source for understanding the internal climate of the Führer bunker. It was the belated confession of a servant who accompanied Hitler to the very end, and whose loyalty led him from the heart of power to the darkness of exile and confinement. After his release, Heinz Linge settled in the city of Bremen in northern Germany, where he led a quiet life far from the media spotlight. Unlike other former collaborators of the Nazi regime, who in their later years sought notoriety or generated controversy, Linge chose anonymity. Only in the twilight of his life did he decide to speak openly about his experience. In his memoirs, entitled With Hitler to the End, he offered one of the most grim and detailed accounts of the final days of the Third Reich. He died on March 9, 1980, almost 35 years after the collapse of the regime he had devotedly served. His legacy was not one of ideology or redemption. It was a legacy of memory, a direct window into the collapse of Nazism, seen through the eyes of a man who witnessed the fire consume the most feared dictator of the 20th century. If Linge was the shadow that accompanied the Führer, Otto Günsche was his shield. An SS officer and Hitler's personal aide, he was in charge of his physical security, controlling his schedule and overseeing his communications. However, in the final hours of the Reich, his role transcended logistics. Günsche was one of the men who cremated Hitler's lifeless body, fulfilling his expressed wish to avoid falling into Soviet hands. He did so with the coldness of a trained officer and the silence of one who understood the gravity of the moment. Born in 1917, Günsche had been selected for his military discipline and training as an elite SS officer. Since 1944, he had been a permanent member of Hitler's close entourage, and in his final weeks he shared the claustrophobia of the Führer bunker with him. On April 30th, 1945, he waited with Linge and others in the corridor next to the room where Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide. Minutes later, he received a direct order: destroy the bodies. And so he did. On May 2nd, 1945, he was captured by Soviet troops without resistance. Unlike other Nazi officers who attempted to escape, Günsche did not go into hiding. He knew he would be identified. The Soviets soon transferred him to Moscow, where he was held in the Lubyanka prison under the direct supervision of the NKVD. Stalin considered him a key prisoner. He wanted to know if Hitler had really died. He wanted proof, and above all, he wanted a useful account, one that would confirm his suspicions or justify his propaganda. Günsche was interrogated along with other bunker survivors: Linge, Misch, Kempka, Traudl-Junge, and Christa Schroeder. All were subjected to systematic interrogation, sleep deprivation, and physical abuse. The questions were always the same. Was the corpse authentic? Had Hitler escaped? Were there routes to South America? Despite the pressure, Günsche remained steadfast in his version. Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, 1945. His statements, along with those of the other witnesses, were compiled in a secret report entitled Hitler's Book, prepared in 1949 exclusively for Stalin. This document, classified as top secret, remained hidden for decades behind the Iron Curtain. It was a Soviet attempt to psychologically dissect Hitler based on the accounts of those who lived through his final hours. Although he was never formally tried, Günsche spent 11 years in prison. He was held in Bautzen prison, run by the East German secret police, where he lived in isolation and without hope of redemption. He was not released until May 2nd, 1956, exactly 11 years after his surrender, as part of a process of repatriation of German prisoners. He returned to a very different Germany, fragmented by the Cold War and in the process of silently reintegrating former members of the Nazi regime. Unlike others, Otto Günsche chose to remain silent. He never granted interviews, participated in historical debates, or attempted to justify his actions. His life was lived in the shadows, as if his past were too heavy a burden to face publicly. He died on October 2nd, 2003, in Limburg an der Lahn, a victim of heart failure. He was 86 years old. With him, another of the last voices who witnessed the collapse of the Third Reich from the very heart of its ruin passed away. His story faded into silence, but the events he witnessed continue to resonate in the world's memory. Wilhelm Mohnke, from Hitler's personal guard to the last battle in Berlin. Wilhelm Mohnke was one of the most loyal men in Adolf Hitler's inner circle. A member of the Nazi Party from its earliest days, he began his career as the dictator's personal bodyguard in 1933. Over time, he rose within the Waffen-SS to reach the rank of general. In April 1945, as the Red Army surrounded Berlin, Hitler entrusted him with one of the most desperate missions of the entire conflict: to protect the core of the regime, including the Reich Chancellery and the Führer bunker. At the head of some 2,000 combatants, including SS soldiers, members of the Volkssturm, and civilians trapped in the city, Mohnke led Kampfgruppe Mohnke, the last bastion of direct defense of the Führer. Despite suffering a leg wound in late April, Mohnke refused to retreat. He remained in his post even after Hitler's suicide on April 30th, and briefly assumed command over the few pockets of resistance that still lingered in central Berlin. On May 1st, he received authorization to attempt to break out of the Soviet encirclement. He organized a retreat with what remained of his forces, officers, escorts, and a few civilians. His objective was to cross enemy lines, reach areas controlled by the Western Allies, or simply disappear into the ruins. But chaos and destruction reigned in the capital. That night, the group was ambushed by Soviet fire near an S-Bahn station. The escape attempt failed. The unit dispersed, and the next day, May 2nd, 1945, Wilhelm Mohnke was captured. For the Soviets, this was a significant capture. He was immediately transferred to Moscow and imprisoned in the Lubyanka prison, headquarters of the feared NKVD. There he was intensively interrogated for months, as were other members of Hitler's inner circle. Although he had led the final defense of Berlin, Mohnke was never formally charged with war crimes. Nevertheless, he remained imprisoned for over 10 years while Soviet authorities sought to extract all possible knowledge about the bunker, the structure of the Nazi regime, and Hitler's death. After passing through various Soviet prisons, he was finally released in October 1955 as part of an amnesty agreed between the USSR and West Germany. Upon his return home, he settled in Hamburg and led a discreet life as a truck dealer. He consistently refused to speak to the press or participate in interviews. He avoided any public appearances or comments about his days in the bunker. However, his name did not completely fade. In subsequent years, he was investigated for his alleged involvement in the execution of Canadian soldiers during the Normandy campaign in 1944. However, he was never convicted, and the investigation was closed due to a lack of definitive evidence. Wilhelm Mohnke died in 2001 at the age of 90, without having given any public explanation about his role in the final days of Nazism. His silence was as thick as the smoke that covered Berlin in the final days of the Third Reich. His story, like that of many who remained loyal to the end, was buried in ruins and shadows. During the 1960s, in the midst of a review of the Nazi past in West Germany, researchers began to look with fresh eyes at figures who had escaped judicial scrutiny. One of the names that generated the greatest controversy was that of Wilhelm Mohnke, not only because of his closeness to Adolf Hitler, but also because of his alleged involvement in crimes committed long before the final days of the Third Reich. The most serious accusation dates back to May 1940 during the campaign in France. There, in the town of Wormhout, SS units executed British prisoners after their surrender. Although it was never proven that Mohnke gave the direct order, his name was linked to the massacre due to his command role in the area. Years later, in 1944, during the Normandy campaign, new allegations emerged. Troops under his command had murdered captured Canadian soldiers. These accusations followed Mohnke for the rest of his life, although they never resulted in a formal conviction. There was no irrefutable proof, and no witness could conclusively confirm his direct involvement in the executions. In 1988, the issue resurfaced in the British Parliament. Some MPs publicly questioned why Wilhelm Mohnke had never faced trial. Documents surfaced including him on a list of war criminals drawn up by the United Nations after the war. This led to the reopening of investigations in Germany, but prosecutors encountered the usual obstacles: incomplete files, deceased witnesses, and a general lack of evidence that would stand the test of time. Mohnke, for his part, consistently denied any responsibility. He claimed that he never gave orders to kill prisoners, that his actions complied with military law, and that the battlefield was a chaotic environment where many decisions were beyond individual control. Even so, his name remained marked by suspicion. Mohnke's case was not an exception, but a reflection of an uncomfortable reality. Justice after World War II was fragmented, uneven, and often unattainable. Many former Nazi officers managed to reintegrate into society without answering for their actions. As time passed, prosecutions became increasingly unlikely. Memories faded, evidence was lost, and the world preferred to look forward. In his later years, Mohnke agreed to speak on rare occasions with historians. He admitted that the final days of the Third Reich were marked by disorder, fear, and the complete disintegration of the chain of command, but he consistently maintained his innocence in the face of accusations of war crimes. He died on August 6, 2001 in Barspüttel near Hamburg. He was 90 years old. He was one of the last high-ranking Waffen-SS officers to survive the war and the post-war period without being tried. His story embodies a complex truth. The defeat of Nazism did not erase the past of its protagonists, many of whom moved for decades between anonymity and suspicion. Wilhelm Mohnke lived his final years in peace, while his name continued to appear in the margins of court records and history books. He was not found guilty, nor was he exonerated. His legacy remained trapped in a grey space, between memory and oblivion, between rumor and impunity. Although the names of Wilhelm Mohnke, Erich Kempka, Rochus Misch, and Heinz Linge frequently appear among the survivors of Hitler's final circle, there were other, lesser-known men who also held key positions in his inner circle and who lived to see the collapse of the Third Reich. One of them was Bruno Günsche, a founding member of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the elite unit created as the dictator's personal escort. For years, Günsche guarded Hitler both in Berlin and at the Berghof, his Alpine retreat. However, his career was cut short in 1944, when he was dismissed from his post due to disciplinary problems, alcohol abuse, and clashes with other officers. Despite his closeness to Hitler in the early years of the regime, Günsche managed to survive the conflict without facing any significant legal charges. He lived the rest of his life discreetly and died in Hanover in 1982. His case illustrates how several of the men who physically protected Hitler were able to evade punishment and reintegrate into society without leaving much of a trace. Another representative case is that of Karl Wilhelm Krause, who served as Adolf Hitler's personal valet and valet during the 1930s. During those years when the dictator's power was still consolidating, Krause witnessed the Nazi leader's transformation into the absolute symbol of the regime. However, his closeness to the Führer was short-lived. Over time, he was replaced and relegated to secondary roles, losing access to the inner circle of power. Captured by French troops at the end of the war in 1945, Krause spent several years in prison. He was released in 1947, and from then on his life fell into a haze of anonymity. He never wrote memoirs, gave interviews, or participated in public debates about his role within the regime. He died in 1959, leaving behind a fragmented, almost erased history, like that of so many others who shared Hitler's daily life but chose to disappear after the defeat. The trajectories of these individuals, from high-ranking Waffen-SS officers to routine assistants, drivers, valets, and personal escorts, reveal a little explored but essential dimension of the Third Reich: the existence of an operational, functional, and everyday structure that allowed Nazism to sustain itself, not only through ideological fanaticism or institutionalized terror, but also through the silent, methodical, and obedient work of hundreds of loyal collaborators. Not all were war criminals according to the Nuremberg legal criteria, but many were key cogs in the machinery of a repressive system. While the names of Himmler, Goebbels, and Goering dominate the history books, those who drove their vehicles, prepared their suits, served their meals, or transmitted their orders remain in a historical fog, uncomfortable and often ignored. At the end of World War II, some of these men were prosecuted, others were interrogated and released, most were simply forgotten. Some attempted to rewrite their past through memoirs or public appearances in an attempt to justify their role or at least explain their point of view. But overall, the legacy of this second tier of Nazism remains ambiguous, neither completely forgotten nor adequately examined. Remembering them does not imply justifying their actions, but rather understanding the mechanisms by which a totalitarian regime like Hitler's managed to remain in power for more than a decade. History is not constructed solely through grand speeches and atrocious crimes, but also through the daily gestures of obedience. Through administrative silence, through unwavering loyalty, and through the apparent normality of those who served the horror from the backrooms of power. The mere existence of these individuals and the decisions they made, whether out of conviction, fear, or convenience, confronts us with an essential question. What happens when loyalty to duty and obedience to authority become excuses for ignoring, collaborating, or facilitating evil? This voluntary withdrawal from public debate, so common among members of Hitler's inner circle, seems to respond more to a need for survival than to a true moral confrontation with the past. Figures such as August Kerber and Adolf Dier, members of the Führer's personal staff and members of the Führer Begleitkommando, FBK, were also captured after the fall of the Third Reich. Converted into prisoners of war, they were released in 1946. They never wrote or spoke publicly about their experiences. Their names barely appear in official records. Their story, like that of many others, faded into the post-war flux. This silence not only reflects a personal choice, but also highlights the structural limitations of the denazification process. An effort that, although ambitious, focused its energy on prosecuting the regime's most visible leaders, leaving a wide range of collaborators and perpetrators in the shadows. Media and judicial attention were monopolized by the major criminals, while many of their assistants, bodyguards, valets, or clerks emerged unscathed from historical scrutiny. Because in the end, the Third Reich was not sustained only by those who signed decrees or gave speeches from the chancellery balcony. It also survived and killed thanks to those who day after day wore the uniform, followed orders, and preferred not to ask questions. The whereabouts and fates of these men are difficult to track, suggesting how many members of Hitler's inner circle simply vanished from the historical record. But not all escaped with their lives. Some members of the Führer's entourage died tragically or violently, swept away by the collapse of the regime they had devotedly served. One of them was Hans Rattenhuber, brother of Johann Rattenhuber, head of the Reich Sicherheitsdienst, Hitler's personal security service. Hans remained at his post, guarding the bunker facilities even during the final air raids on Berlin. He died in combat near the chancellery. His body was never found. His end symbolizes the fate of many loyal Nazis. to die alongside their leader, enveloped in the darkness and chaos of the collapse. Another example is Hans Hermann Junge, the dictator's personal bodyguard and husband of Eva Braun. He was sent to the front in 1944, where he died in combat in Normandy. His death deeply affected Braun, who would accompany Hitler until their shared suicide in April 1945 inside the Führer bunker. There were also key figures in the civilian sphere. One of them was Traudl Junge, Hitler's personal secretary from 1942. Junge survived the siege, Soviet captivity, and the passing of time. After his release, he settled in West Germany and wrote his memoirs, Until the Last Hour. In them, he offered an intimate, lucid, and critical account of his experience with the dictator. He died in 2002, leaving behind one of the few first-person accounts of the internal collapse of the Third Reich. Not everyone suffered the same fate. Kurt Steinbach, Magda Goebbels' driver, was arrested shortly after the end of the war. During his captivity, he took his own life. Like many other members of the regime, he chose death rather than face a world without Hitler. These examples reveal an uncomfortable truth. Not all those who served the dictator were part of the SS or the High Command. Many were civilians, drivers, secretaries, assistants, but all of them, in one way or another, participated in the machinery that sustained the Third Reich. These justifications were difficult to contradict without compelling evidence or irrefutable statements. After the war, both the Allies and the newly installed German authorities focused their judicial efforts on the highest officials of the Nazi regime, Himmler, Göring, Kaltenbrunner, among others. As a result, many of Hitler's inner circle subordinates were left out of the major judicial proceedings. During the 1960s, attempts were made to reopen investigations against figures such as Wilhelm Mohnke, but a paucity of documentary evidence and a lack of key witnesses prevented any judicial progress. Others, such as Rochus Misch and Heinz Linge, were questioned, albeit more as historical witnesses than as potential defendants. Intelligence services and some media outlets sought them for what they had seen, not for what they had done. As the end of the 20th century approached, the judicial system no longer pursued them, but historical memory, on the other hand, did not forget them. Headlines like, "Hitler's Last Bodyguard Turns 90," revealed more a morbid fascination with the longevity of these men than a genuine interest in obtaining justice. The stories they offered were not confessions of guilt, but personal accounts. Rather than accepting responsibility, they shared memories. Their legacy, ethical, moral, and historical, remains ambiguous, difficult to digest, and extremely uncomfortable. Some of them, like Misch and Linge, never renounced their loyalty. Misch, even in his later years, spoke of Hitler with a respect that bordered on the emotional. He described him as a demanding yet humane leader. This loyalty, reinforced by military indoctrination and the concept of blind obedience to duty, contributed to the fact that, after the war, many in the Western world hesitated to judge them harshly. They were seen more as soldiers caught in a ruthless machine than as conscious participants in their crimes. Others, like Linge and Erich Kempka, chose to disappear from public life. Their silence after the war was interpreted by many as a passive way of evading responsibility. A choice that reveals the emotional, ethical, and psychological difficulties of facing the horrors in which they were implicated, even if they did not directly perpetrate them. When Rochus Misch died in 2013, the last living chapter of Hitler's inner circle closed. With him, the last voice that witnessed firsthand the absolute collapse of the Third Reich from inside the bunker was extinguished. Since then, historians have had to reconstruct those final days from memoirs, interrogations, and interviews, invaluable documents, but inevitably conditioned by the passage of time, subjectivity, and the instinct for self-preservation. Today, looking back, the collective fate of Hitler's bodyguards, assistants, and chauffeurs might seem like a mere footnote in the history books. But it isn't. Many of them lived for decades after the collapse of the Third Reich. Almost always away from public scrutiny, they reintegrated into everyday life. They had children, worked, and grew old in silence. Their quiet existence contrasts starkly with the violence of the regime they defended to the very last day. They were, in the end, human beings caught in the whirlwind of history, and perhaps therein lies the most disturbing lesson, that those closest to evil were not always monsters, but ordinary people shaped by obedience, fear, ideology, and circumstance. The shadow of their service still lingers. It challenges us to remember soberly, not to forget, and to recognize the human and tragically banal dimension behind the darkest events of the 20th century. From the cold interrogation rooms to the peaceful post-war neighborhoods, these men shared a common destiny: silence. The Führer's bunker was sealed, the SS uniforms were abandoned, and those who had once been at the heart of Nazi power vanished almost without a trace. As we have seen in this series, their fates varied. Some faced torture, others received minimal sentences or immediate release. Most were never tried. They returned to their lives as if the world, and themselves, could begin anew. For many, the end was a silent transition with no visible justice. But their stories, however fragmentary, force us to stare squarely at the fine line between obedience and complicity. To ask ourselves, to what extent can duty justify moral blindness? What do we do with those who served evil, but did not lead it? How do we prevent forgetting from becoming a form of impunity? As long as we remember, these chapters will not disappear, and only by understanding the humanity and dehumanization behind them can we build a truly honest memory of the past. In 2013, with the death of Rochus Misch, Adolf Hitler's last surviving bodyguard and personal aide, direct testimony about the final days of the Third Reich disappeared forever. Since then, only memoirs, interrogations, and archives have remained as silent witnesses to that dark time. Misch became, in a way, the symbol of a generation of men who remained loyal to the end. Until his final days, he insisted that Hitler was not a monster. A revealing statement, showing the extent to which some clung to the personal bond with their leader, ignoring or justifying the crimes committed under his command. This blind loyalty left an uncomfortable legacy. On the one hand, it likely allowed them to evade harsher moral or judicial condemnation. On the other, it cast a shadow of denial that even today hinders our understanding of justice, complicity, and individual responsibility. So, what can we learn from the lives these men led after the war? How do we interpret their quiet survival in contrast to the brutal fall of the regime they defended? Were they mere soldiers swept away by the tide of history, or active participants in a criminal machine? And perhaps more importantly, what do their stories teach us about the nature of loyalty, blind obedience, and humanity in times of moral collapse? The collective story of these men, reconstructed from documents, memoirs, interrogations, and scattered fragments, reveals that after the collapse of Nazism, the guardians of the regime scattered like dust in the wind. Many faded into civilian life, leading silent, discreet, and anonymous lives for decades. Far from the spotlight, they escaped public judgment and, in many cases, any form of accountability. When reflecting on their legacy, the essential question is not just how we remember these men, but how we remember what they stood for. How do we prevent the darkest chapters of history from fading into oblivion, especially when those who lived and protected them managed to hide in plain sight? Of all those mentioned who served Hitler, many were executed, others were not tried or convicted. Many lived decades in silence, integrated into societies that after the horror preferred to turn the page. Some wrote memoirs, others remained forever silent. But they all shared a common shadow, that of having served the deadliest regime of the 20th century. They witnessed the end of an era and survived a loyalty that, over time, became uncomfortable. Today, their story is remembered not for heroism or redemption, but for what it reveals about the power of obedience, the banality of evil, and the ease with which horror can hide behind ordinary faces. Because in the end, Hitler's bodyguards didn't just guard a man, they guarded a regime, and their fate, silent and unjust, compels us not to forget what happens when blind loyalty replaces conscience.